Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something a bit less textbook and a whole lot more botanical. We're stepping into the misty, aromatic realm of medieval intoxication. Yep, they were definitely indulging. And believe me, things got pretty strange and surprisingly imaginative. Before we get started, if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to give the video a like and hit that subscribe button, but only if you're truly into what I create here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're watching this. I love seeing how far and wide you all tune in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that relaxing white noise, and let's gently wander into tonight's strange little corner of history. We often picture the Middle Ages as a bleak, mud-caked timeline filled with monks, misery, and maybe the odd potato. But beneath all those layers of wool and woe, there were curious, flawed, and often quite adventurous people. People who, now and then, stared at a peculiar-looking root and thought, what if I boiled this in wine and see what happens? And honestly, can you blame them? No electricity, no espresso, no mood stabilizers. Entertainment consisted of either watching a night struggle through a scroll or seeing how long your neighbor could dance before collapsing from contaminated rye bread. So if someone whispered to you about a mushroom that could make you forget your feudal obligations for a few hours, you'd probably eat it too. Unlike what many assume today, the use of substances to lift spirits, numb pain, or just make daily life a little more bearable wasn't strange. It was deeply woven into the social and spiritual fabric of the time. But they didn't call it getting high. There were no medieval duos giggling behind the haystacks. It was cloaked in language like visions, divine enlightenment, pain relief, or in some unfortunate cases, oops. Herbs were handled by healers, grown by monks, used by so-called witches, or sacred women depending on whom you asked, and touched nearly everyone's life through medicine, rituals, or even by accident, like a loaf of moldy bread that packed a psychedelic punch. The list of medieval intoxicants went well beyond just warm, frothy ale, though that certainly had its place. They had roots that howled, petals that made the world wobble, seeds that summoned dreams, and bombs that convinced folks they were soaring nude across the moonlit sky with Satan's catering crew. Getting altered wasn't always about fun. Sometimes it was medicinal, sometimes it was mystical, and sometimes it was just a terrible idea paired with an empty belly. Your status didn't matter much, whether it was a barber, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf who learned herbal tricks from a particularly chatty squirrel. Someone had something for you. There were no sketchy alleyways or exclusive clubs. Your supplier? Mother Nature herself. All you needed was a backyard, a grinding stone, and a dangerously vague sense of how much was too much. Medieval Europe was bursting with plants, fungi, roots, and resins, any of which might soothe a headache or convince you married an oak tree. The line between healing and hallucination? Let's just say, interpretive. Doctors, monks, midwives, and herbal wanderers all explored the botanical arts with a wide range of training and enthusiasm. If you were looking to sleep, calm your soul, or meet God in your barley stew, there were options. Take henbane, for example, Mother Nature's version of a dice roll. Prepared correctly, it dulled pain and coaxed sleep. Handled poorly, it brought spasms, confusion, and an uncontrollable urge to run barefoot through the forest while screaming and trying to take off your own shoes. Or how about mandrake, a root shaped eerily like a miniature person? Legend claimed it let out a deadly shriek when uprooted, so terrifying it could kill a man on the spot. Did that stop people? Not a chance. They just tied it to a dog, stood back, and let the pup do the risky part. Consumed mandrake could knock you out, conjure visions, and maybe, if you were lucky, give you glimpses of the future. If you weren't lucky, well, let's just say you wouldn't need any more herbs. Then there was belladonna, better known as deadly nightshade, which, yes, sounds like something you probably shouldn't mess with. It was used to make eyes appear more striking, relieve pain, bring on vivid hallucinations, and sometimes usher in death. Medieval wellness routines were not for the faint of heart. These herbs were blended into teas, elixirs, oils, and the infamous flying ointments. We'll get to those. And they weren't always taken willingly. Sometimes they were part of religious rites, medical procedures, or applied by an apothecary who thought a bit more root couldn't hurt. Spoiler, it absolutely could. Henbane again, the medieval version of pushing a mysterious button, just to see what happens. Known formally as Hyoscyamus niger, and informally as that stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, henbane was a major player in Europe's underground herbal scene for generations. It wasn't just a plant, it was an experience. Monks wrote about it. Healers swore by it. And somewhere, someone was probably digging it up with high hopes, and very low caution doctors turned to it for pain relief. Alleged witches used it for their wild mental journeys, fueled by imagination and broomsticks. And the average villager? They mostly just hoped they didn't end up eating it by mistake. So, what exactly was henbane capable of? Well, that varied. In low amounts, it worked as a calming agent. It could numb a bad tooth, help someone get some rest, or take the edge off childbirth, which, let's face it, was pretty harrowing back then. Think of it as the medieval version of take two and try not to scream. But larger doses, or even just using it at the wrong time, could launch you straight into a world of confusion, visions, chaotic behavior, and in some cases, an emotional heart-to-heart with a turnip you believe was your long-dead grandmother. That's because henbane contains compounds like scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which mess with the brain's chemical signals. To put it less scientifically, once it kicks in, your medieval brain starts throwing a party you didn't plan for. Distorted sights, a total lack of orientation, cottonmouth, desperate thirst, and spontaneous interpretive dance were all common side effects. It was smoke, steeped into teas, or blended with fat and rubbed onto the skin, ideal for those who preferred their thoughts to come in non-linear spirals. Was it legal? Technically, yes. There were no drug laws back then. But it was controversial, especially in religious circles. Anything that changed how you perceive reality was instantly suspicious. After all, divine visions were supposed to come from angels, not your herb garden. Still, henbane had its admirers, healers, mystics, and people with absolutely nothing left to lose. It even found its way into medieval beer recipes before being swapped out for safer ingredients like hops. Now, if there was ever a plant that inspired both awe and pure panic, it was the mandrake. This root, which looked disturbingly like a tiny, twisted person, became the stuff of botanical myth and mystery. Its proper name is Mandragora officinarum, and it was linked to sleep, fertility, hallucinations, and the distinct possibility of either divine insight or waking up beside a goat with no memory of how you got there. Herbalists in the Middle Ages believed that the mandrake held powerful magical and healing traits. It acted as a sedative, a painkiller, an aphrodisiac, and some even claimed it opened the door to prophetic dreams. You could steep it in wine to numb pain or inhale its vapor and suddenly regret your entire life's choices. But what truly made mandrake famous was the legend that it screamed when pulled from the earth. Not metaphorically, literally. Supposedly, its cry was so unbearable it could kill a person just for hearing it. To avoid this terrible fate, harvesters got creative. The most well-known method involved tying the root to a dog and walking away, letting the poor animal do the dangerous part. The hope was the dog would perish from the scream instead of the human. Even by medieval standards. Yikes. Once safely retrieved, and the dog properly eulogized, the root could be dried, powdered, brewed, or even worn around the neck as a magical charm. Some carried tiny mandrake dolls in their pockets for luck or fertility. Because nothing says romance like a shriveled root with a 1,000-yard stare. Naturally, the church was not a fan. Any plant linked to visions, especially ones that didn't involve saints, was treated as heresy adjacent. Still, monks quietly scribbled down mandrake remedies in their herbals, often with suspiciously detailed notes. Used properly, the mandrake could ease surgical pain, lull someone to sleep, or produce vivid dreams. Used badly, it might lead to violent nausea, blackouts, or your family calling a priest because your soup started chanting. Now, imagine you're a noblewoman trying to turn heads at a grand banquet. You could wear your finest gown. You could weave flowers into your braids. Or, if you were feeling particularly bold, you could drip actual poison into your eyes. Enter belladonna, also known as Atropa belladonna, or, more honestly, deadly nightshade. That name sounds like it belongs to a medieval boss battle, and fittingly so. It was alluring, dangerous, and just a little bit unhinged. Like a dangerously charming ex. Belladonna literally means beautiful woman, because women used it to make their eyes appear wider and more enchanting. Dilated pupils were seen as mysterious and ethereal. though they also cause blurred vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional oops, I walked into a pillar. But beauty wasn't belladonna's only job. It also served as a sedative, a sleep aid, and even, on rare occasions, a truth serum. Although the truths it pulled out often sounded like, "The ceiling is whispering" in Latin. This plant contains atropine and scopolamine, which scramble your nervous system with effects ranging from light euphoria to full-blown, "Why is the wallpaper moving?" Belladonna was a frequent ingredient in potions, flying ointments, and some truly questionable medical rituals. Need to numb a limb before hacking it off? Belladonna. Want to mimic death for a dramatic escape? Belladonna. Looking to chat with angels or accidentally the devil in your dreams? Yep, belladonna again. Despite being absolutely toxic, belladonna held a respected place in the medieval medical cabinet. Doctors used it, sometimes carefully, sometimes with the reckless abandon of someone who just wanted to get through another plague wave. It appeared in herbal guides, romantic charms, and more than a few questionable cures. Before modern-day edibles came neatly packaged with gummy flavors, people in the Middle Ages were already crafting psychedelic concoctions, just without the chocolate. Instead, they had their pick of potions, salves, brews, and balms. And let's be honest, the word ointment has never exactly screamed safe, especially when the recipe includes belladonna, rendered cat fat, and a pinch of something that probably shouldn't be glowing. Not everyone loves setting the mood, and apparently, so did medieval clergy. They claimed that incense helped souls rise heavenward. In truth, it probably just took the edge off reality enough to survive 5-hour sermons without completely losing your mind. Think of it like the old school version of lighting a candle and playing lo-fi beats, except replace the chill vibes with chanting in Latin and cold stone pews. If there was one thing people in the Middle Ages could rely on, besides taxes and the occasional round of plague, it was alcohol. Ale, wine, beer, cider, you name it. Someone was brewing it in a wooden tub behind their home and calling it medicine. And to be fair, it kind of was. Drinking water was often a gamble. Natural sources were polluted, thanks in part to livestock and waste being upstream neighbors. So every drink from a river or stream was basically intestinal roulette. That's where small beer came in, the medieval version of flavored water, but with alcohol. And a decent chance it was made by a woman named Edith who eyeballed ingredients and prayed for the best. This mild brew was sipped daily by everyone, kids included, not to get drunk, but to stay hydrated with just enough buzz to tolerate reality. Of course, not every medieval drink was that tame. If you had money or zero responsibilities the next morning, you could treat yourself to stronger ales, meads, or imported wine. Wine was often enhanced with herbs and spices, either for health benefits or just to see what it would do to your afternoon. In monasteries, brewing was practically a divine calling. Monks refined beer recipes, documented fermentation techniques, and tested every batch with what could only be described as holy enthusiasm. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were early pioneers. But alcohol wasn't just for sipping. It was a coping mechanism. To dull toothache pain, have some ale. Feeling down? Try a warm cup of spiced wine. Need to forget you share your one-room home with 6 people and a very critical chicken? Mead. Taverns and roadside inns were the Middle Ages' answer to therapy. People drink to celebrate, grieve, complain, and occasionally invent interpretive dance moves no one asked for. Sometimes, though, people didn't choose to get high. It just sort of happened, like at breakfast. Enter ergot, a sneaky parasitic fungus that infects rye and other grains. To the medieval eye, it looked like a slightly funky black kernel. To modern science, it's more like nature's twisted joke, with side effects that sound like a curse from a grim fairy tale: seizures, hallucinations, burning limbs, and the sensation that your fingers have turned into spiders. Ergot may have been history's original unintentional psychedelic. Long before Woodstock or tie-dye, whole villages across Europe, especially in cold, damp areas like France or the Germanic lands, bake bread with contaminated grain. Why? Because when you're starving, funky flour is better than no flour. The result? Both incredible and terrifying. There were 2 main types of ergotism. Yes, it had a name. Convulsive ergotism caused tremors, fits, hallucinations, and uncontrollable laughter or terror. Gangrenous ergotism restricted blood flow so badly that limbs turned black, shriveled, and sometimes just fell off. Not exactly the stuff of charming dinner parties. Outbreaks often led to bizarre public behavior, including so-called dancing plagues, where crowds danced for hours or days, some collapsing from exhaustion, or worse. At the time, people blamed demons, divine wrath, or weak morals. In truth, it may have just been a whole town unknowingly tripping on cursed toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, who ran hospitals for the afflicted, helped treat these symptoms by switching people to wheat instead of rye. Yes, the cure was different bread. But did people realize that? Not at all. To a medieval baker, bread was either edible or possessed by evil spirits, and no one was testing their breakfast for hallucinogens. They were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Some scholars even believe ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials, what with the paranoia, strange visions, and sudden fits. It's still debated, but one thing's clear. Medieval Europe was tripping on toast without even knowing it. You've probably heard of magic mushrooms and flying ointments, but have you heard of mad honey? That's right, even bees got in on the action. But this wasn't your average sweet spread. This rare type of honey came from the Black Sea Mountains of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees fed on rhododendron flowers. Beautiful blooms, but packed with granotoxins, compounds that are extremely unfriendly to the human nervous system. The result? Mad honey, a naturally psychoactive substance. In small amounts, it gave a pleasant buzz. In large doses, it brought on nausea, slowed heartbeat, hallucinations, and full-blown spiritual journeys, usually in that order. And no, this wasn't just a curious local delicacy. It was sometimes weaponized. According to ancient and medieval records, invading armies were lured with abandoned honeypots. Soldiers would feast, thinking they'd stumbled upon free rations, only to end up writhing in the woods, realizing way too late that bees cannot be trusted. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo wrote about these effects centuries earlier, but the tradition carried well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle mad honey. A little on bread to ease a headache, a drop in wine for a vision, or nothing at all if you wanted to stay grounded. It became both a folk remedy and a recreational substance, particularly in mystic circles. Some claimed it brought prophetic dreams. Others just woke up clutching a potato they were convinced was their uncle. And yes, it was sold. Some ambitious traders packed it into ceramic jars, often without instructions or warnings. Because who needs a dosage chart when your idea of cutting-edge medicine involves leeches and moon phases? Some individuals operated on the fringes of mainstream medieval society: shamans, herbalists, folk healers, and those known as cunning folk. Think of them as the unlicensed pharmacists of the day, with no official training, but a surprisingly intimate understanding of moss. These were the people you went to after the town physician suggested bleeding you out to fix a sore tooth. They didn't hold diplomas, but they had knowledge passed down through generations, often learned by watching their elders treat ailments with bark, herbs, and quiet grit. And when it came to altering consciousness, these were the experts. They knew which plants to crush into paste, which roots to soak in wine, and exactly how much of any given herb would send you into a heavenly vision without actually sending you to heaven. Whether your goal was to ease pain, enter a trance, hex a rival, or momentarily leave your body while doing laundry, chances are they had a solution ready. Many of these practitioners were women, midwives, local healers, and wise women. They were pillars of their communities, yet feared by those in power, not because they stirred cauldrons with evil laughter, but because they knew too much and didn't need Latin to explain it. Their remedies often included potent plants like henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and poppy extract. They'd mix these with wine, animal fat, honey, or even spit really chant protective verses, and hand you something that could either cure your ailment or convince you to confess to stealing a goat 3 times over. And when things went sideways, say you saw flying goats or decided to marry a tree, it didn't take long for blame to shift from bad batch to witchcraft. The church and local authorities kept a close, suspicious eye on these healers, often with a nervous twitch. Still, communities leaned on them. If your child was feverish, your knees ached, or you needed to consult your dead aunt about the hidden rent money, these were the ones you turned to. They weren't doctors. They weren't priests. They were the original underground wellness scene, medieval influencers without the sponsored content. After all the tinctures, poultices, potions, incense, bees, and mysterious loaves of bread. One big question lingers. How did medieval people really feel about getting high? The answer? Complicated. Deeply, hilariously conflicted. For some, especially healers and herbalists, mind-altering herbs were just another tool in the kit. If it dulled pain, calmed a frantic mind, or made childbirth slightly more bearable, it was welcome. It wasn't mischief. It was medicine. Sure, your patient might start quoting scripture backward or claim the cat was fluent in French, but if the swelling went down, that was a win. Then there were the spiritual users, monks, mystics, and vision seekers. To them, hallucinations weren't cause for concern, they were divine messages. If you stared into the void and it whispered back, in Latin, preferably, that could land you a halo or at least a stained glass cameo. But motive mattered. Getting high by accident? Understandable. Getting high to see angels? Acceptable. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon? Now we have a problem. That's where the church drew the line. Certain herbs, rituals, and users were branded dangerous, heretical at worst, suspicious at best. Any state of altered perception was unsettling to religious authorities. Saints could have visions. Peasants were probably just possessed. Among regular folks, however, attitudes were more practical. Your neighbor's sleeping draft might also be a mild hallucinogen. People drank poppy wine for pain, used hashish to unwind, and sipped henbane tea to cope with relatives. It wasn't about rebellion or mysticism. It was just part of everyday health, sitting on the shelf next to garlic cloves and whispered prayers. Ultimately, your experience with medieval highs depended on who you were, what you took, and whether anyone noticed. In the medieval mind, altered states lived in a strange gray zone, somewhere between miracle and misdemeanor, health treatment and heresy. And in a world where saints, demons, plagues, and angry root vegetables all seemed to coexist, the occasional herbal escape didn't sound like such a terrible idea. In the ancient world, the ocean wasn't just something to cross, it was the lifeblood of empires. It moved grain, gold, letters, soldiers, and sometimes war itself. Whoever controlled the seas didn't just rule the water, they held the power to shape history. While battles on land were shaped by terrain, naval warfare was about control of trade routes, communication lines, and access to resources. For coastal empires like Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, maritime dominance wasn't optional, it was essential. Without ships, cities could be starved, cut off, or overwhelmed. With a strong fleet, they could blockade enemies, protect merchants, and even launch surprise attacks far from home. Take the Mediterranean, for example. It wasn't called the Middle Sea by accident. This vast inland ocean linked 3 continents and countless cultures. To dominate, it was to hold a key position in everything from Phoenician commerce to Roman grain imports. The sea could bring enormous wealth or devastating destruction. That's why ancient civilizations invested heavily in their naval infrastructure. Harbors, dry docks, shipyards, and navies were essential national assets. For Athens, the navy wasn't just important, it was everything. Thanks to Themistocles, the Athenian fleet became the cornerstone of its power. These triremes not only secured food routes from Egypt and collected tribute from allies, but also delivered crushing defeats to enemies, like the Persians at Salamis. Carthage, on the other hand, rose from trading routes to become a maritime superpower. Its shipyards were technological marvels, able to mass-produce warships like a floating factory. Carthaginian strength came not just from numbers, but from generations of skilled sailors who knew every current and coastline like the back of their salt-weathered hands. Egypt, situated at a crossroads of sea and sand. Situated between the Nile Delta and the Red Sea, Egypt also placed great importance on its fleets to safeguard trade routes with Nubia and the Levant. Although primarily focused on river-based travel, Egyptian warships eventually transformed into capable sea vessels, ready to fend off pirates and escort cargo ships loaded with riches. In these ancient empires, naval warfare wasn't some optional sideshow, it was the main theater. The oceans were where power struggles unfolded, alliances fell apart, and civilizations either rose or collapsed. Those who mastered the seas, through advanced shipbuilding, tactical expertise, and sharp geographic awareness, often became legends. And when their fleets burned or sank, the downfall of even the most powerful empires wasn't far behind. One vessel in particular defined ancient naval combat, the trireme. More than just a ship, it was a streamlined, lethal instrument of war, swift, maneuverable, and engineered for destruction. While various city-states built triremes, none employed them with as much precision and skill as Athens. Armed with 3 stacked rows of oars and a bronze-tipped ram, the trireme was the ancient world's answer to a guided missile, only one powered by muscle, rhythm, and tactical genius. These ships were about 120 feet in length and barely 18 feet across. That narrow design wasn't a flaw, it was intentional. It allowed the vessel to cut cleanly through the water and navigate shallow shores with ease, perfect for coastal raids or quick landings. The name trireme comes from its triple-tiered oar system. But these weren't untrained slaves pulling the oars. They were skilled rowers who had to move in perfect sync, reaching speeds up to 9 knots. The ship's most dangerous feature was its ram, a bronze-covered point at the prow, strengthened with oak, meant to smash through the hulls of enemy ships. But successful ramming wasn't just about momentum. It demanded precise aim and timing. Strike too directly, and you might lodge your own ship in the target, or flip over entirely. Elite captains, especially within the Athenian navy, mastered moves like the deeplis, a tactic involving slipping through enemy lines, turning quickly, and delivering a blow to an exposed flank. Above deck, each trireme carried a small unit of soldiers, typically 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites, along with a few archers. These troops would leap onto enemy vessels during close combat, or defend their own from being overrun. But make no mistake, the trireme wasn't a fortress, it was a weapon of agility. One bad maneuver, and your sleek warship could quickly become driftwood. What made the Athenian fleet especially groundbreaking wasn't just the ship itself, it was the system supporting it. Funded by public naval treasury known as the Theorica, Athens constructed and maintained hundreds of triremes. Even its poorer citizens served aboard them, especially as rowers, creating an odd sort of democracy afloat on the sea. When Athens crushed the Persian navy at Salamis in 480 BCE, it wasn't nobles steering the victory, it was the people. Naval battles in antiquity weren't chaotic slugfests of cannon fire. They were fast, calculated duels. The objective? Disable or sink the opponent before they could do it to you. And the key to that? Ramming. The idea was to strike the enemy below the waterline using the sharp bronze prow, piercing the hull and sending the vessel down quickly. But this wasn't a matter of charging forward in a straight line. Angle, timing, and coordination all mattered. Come in at the wrong trajectory, and you just glance off the target. Too direct, and you risk embedding yourself in the wreckage. To pull off a successful hit, fleets relied on complex tactics like the deeplis threading between ships and attacking from behind, and the periplus circling the enemy to hit from the side. These weren't brute force assaults. They were acts of coordination and foresight, requiring absolute unity between captain and crew. But when the rams missed, oars snapped, or ships collided and got stuck, Plan B kicked in, boarding. Once vessels locked together, warriors would storm enemy decks, turning naval skirmishes into brutal, close-quarters melees. It was hand-to-hand fighting, fierce, messy, and deadly. Think more bar brawl than battle formation. Archers and slingers added to the chaos, firing from the higher decks at anyone who dared peek out of cover. Some navies, like Rome's, actually preferred this kind of combat. They eventually invented tools like the corvus, a spiked boarding plank designed to hook onto enemy ships and turn sea battles into land-style combat zones. This shift helped Rome overcome more experienced Carthaginian sailors during the First Punic War. Roman strength wasn't in ship handling, it was in sheer infantry force. Of course, this meant sea battles became even more savage. Once boarding began, there was no retreat. Victory meant killing your way across a slippery deck covered in blood, sea spray, and shattered wood. If ramming was the surgical strike of naval combat, then fire was the blunt force trauma. While Athens perfected the trireme, Carthage pushed naval production to an industrial scale. Their circular harbors and dockyards could construct and house hundreds of warships, all supported by a systematic approach to building and repair, unheard of in the ancient world. Carthaginian vessels, like quadriremes and quinquiremes, were bulkier and more powerful than Greek triremes, emphasizing brute strength and shock over nimble agility. These ships favored ramming and boarding, backed by elite mercenary marines and experienced Libyan Phoenician sailors who had spent their lives at sea. But Carthage's strength wasn't just military, it was commercial. Carthaginian merchants explored the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa, trading tin, silver, and luxury goods. The navy ensured these ventures were safe from pirates, rivals, and Roman ambitions. Then came the clash that would change everything, the Punic Wars. As Rome rose in Italy, it realized that to defeat Carthage, it needed to control the sea. With no navy of its own, Rome captured a stranded Carthaginian ship, reverse-engineered it, and added the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval duels into infantry battles. Even with limited maritime experience, the Romans leaned into their strengths, discipline, organization, and overwhelming persistence. Carthage still held its own in the First Punic War, with skilled commanders pulling off stunning victories, like the one at Drepana, where a smaller Carthaginian force destroyed a larger Roman fleet. But Rome's superior logistics and sheer numbers eventually tipped the scales. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage's navy was shattered, its shipyards destroyed, and its influence all but erased. Still, the legend of Carthaginian sea power lived on. They weren't just warriors, they were master navigators, inventive shipwrights, and fearless merchants who ruled the Mediterranean with intellect, trade, and timber. When we picture ancient Egypt, we often think of pyramids, pharaohs, and temples, not warships. But Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to wield significant naval power, both along the Nile and at sea. Though their vessels didn't become as iconic as Greek triremes or Carthaginian quinqueremes, Egyptian ships were essential for maintaining the empire's unity, transporting troops, and defending trade. The Nile served as Egypt's superhighway, linking the fertile delta in the north to the desert regions in the south. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptians were building boats from bundle papyrus reeds, and later from cedar wood imported from Lebanon. These boats ferried grain, gold, statues, and soldiers across the kingdom. Pharaohs also launched naval missions south into Nubia and east across the Red Sea to Punt, a land of incense, ivory, and exotic animals. But Egypt wasn't limited to river power. By the New Kingdom C, 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had developed seaworthy fleets capable of engaging pirates, repelling invasions, and projecting influence abroad. Under leaders like Thutmose III and Ramesses III, Egypt fought naval battles against the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders threatening the eastern Mediterranean. Detailed carvings at Medinet Habu show archers firing from ships and marines locked in hand-to-hand combat on narrow decks. Unlike the sleek or powered triremes of Greece, Egyptian warships were broader, sail-driven vessels with modest maneuverability. They often had raised platforms for fighting and were crewed by archers, spear wielders, and seasoned sailors. Their edge lay in mobility along coastlines and riverways, perfect for deploying troops quickly or intercepting merchant convoys. Naval strength also supported Egypt's economy. Grain exports to the Levant and Red Sea trade with the Arabian Peninsula were safeguarded by patrol ships. Ports like Byblos and Tanis became centers for both trade and naval coordination. Even foreign rulers commissioned Egyptian shipbuilders for their craftsmanship. Over time, Egypt's naval influence declined, succumbing to foreign dominations from Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans. Yet Egypt's legacy in river and coastal warfare endured. Their vessels may not have ruled the open seas, but they commanded the lifeblood of an empire, moving where the Nile flowed, where currents allowed, and where history was made on water. When the Roman Republic first emerged as a major force, it was anything but a maritime power. Rome's initial strength came from its disciplined legions and extensive road networks, not from its shipbuilding capabilities. But that changed rapidly and decisively when the Republic found itself locked in a fierce struggle with Carthage for control of the Mediterranean. This rivalry triggered one of the most impressive naval evolutions in the ancient world. At the onset of the First Punic War in 264 BCE, Rome barely had a fleet to speak of, while Carthage had dominated the seas for generations. Still, the Romans were undeterred. According to legend, they seized a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme and reverse-engineered it to serve as a model. In record time, Rome mobilized its manpower and organizational skills to produce a massive fleet from the ground up. But the Romans knew they couldn't outmaneuver seasoned Carthaginian sailors. So instead, they altered the very nature of naval combat. Enter the corvus, a boarding plank outfitted with a sharp metal spike. This invention transformed sea battles into infantry skirmishes, something Roman soldiers excelled at. With it, Roman Marines could storm enemy vessels en masse, making ship-to-ship combat feel like a land-based brawl. The impact was immediate. In engagements like Mylae and Cape Ignomus, Rome's relatively untested crews triumphed over experienced Carthaginian sailors, thanks to the corvus and sheer aggressive tactics. Although the device was later phased out due to stability issues, it made ships top-heavy. It had already shifted the balance of naval power. By the time of the Second Punic War, Rome had developed a mature naval system. Its warships patrolled the western Mediterranean, safeguarded key supply routes to Iberia and North Africa, and restricted Hannibal's ability to receive reinforcements from Carthage. Amphibious invasions and sea blockades became standard strategies. As the Republic transitioned into empire, Roman maritime control expanded even further. Fleets like the classes Missinensis and classes Ravenatus were established to secure shipping lanes, suppress piracy, and ferry troops across vast distances. Though the navy wasn't always the centerpiece of Roman warfare, it was a critical pillar that supported the empire's logistical and strategic goals, keeping its vast territories connected. Unlike Athens or Carthage, Rome didn't forge a cultural identity around the sea. For the Romans, the ocean was a tool, something to dominate when needed. Yet, by the 1st century CE, their claim of Mare Nostrum, our sea, was more than rhetorical. It was a geopolitical fact. Though born as a land power, Rome's destiny was ultimately decided on water. Through relentless innovation, organization, and adaptability, it transformed the sea from a potential weakness into a fortified frontier. Ancient naval combat wasn't just about ships or weapons. It shaped borders, economies, and entire civilizations. Command of the seas meant much more than battlefield victories. It allowed empires to control trade, disseminate languages and beliefs, and project influence for generations. Take a look at how navies laid the foundation for empires. Athens became a cultural and economic force through its naval strength. Carthage turned maritime mastery into a vast commercial empire. Rome, though a late entrant, harnessed its naval might to dominate the Mediterranean basin. These civilizations all had formidable armies, but their fleets enabled them to strike far from home, defend distant colonies, and throttle enemy commerce. Beyond warfare, the sea acted as a channel for cultural exchange. Greek settlers sailed to found colonies in Italy and Asia Minor, spreading their art, religion, and language. Egyptian vessels carried papyrus, gold, and sacred knowledge to distant courts. Phoenician sailors disseminated their writing system and deities to every coast they touched. Naval supremacy wasn't only about strength, it was civilizational. From a technological standpoint, ancient navies revolutionized ship design and engineering. Innovations like the trireme and later polyremes weren't just military upgrades. They represented leaps in maritime architecture. Ports turned into strategic hubs, and navigational skills became more advanced. Standardized ship designs laid the groundwork for naval traditions seen centuries later in Byzantine and Islamic fleets. The economic implications were just as profound. Secure sea routes fostered reliable trade, allowing luxury goods like silks, spices, wine, and tin to flow between far-flung societies. Coastal cities with strong navies, like Alexandria or Rhodes, blossomed into bustling centers of commerce, learning, and cultural fusion. Even the psychology of war changed. Fire ships, ramming tactics, and brutal boarding actions left a lasting impression on the collective imagination. They illustrated how agility, coordination, and control, rather than brute strength, could determine the outcome of battle. The sea became not just a theater of war, but a weapon in itself. Today, we often celebrate these ancient empires for their terrestrial conquests. But their victories on the waves were equally important and often more enduring. Naval warfare in antiquity wasn't merely about who had the fastest galley or the sharpest ram. It was about who saw the ocean as a strategic stage upon which history would be written. Though the triremes have long vanished from the seas, the legacy they carved into the waters of the Mediterranean still echoes across the tides of history. It wasn't just armies and emperors that shaped the world, it was the sea. From the thunder of Athenian triremes slicing through narrow straits, to the haunting glow of Carthaginian fire ships setting horizons ablaze, the ancient world waged its greatest battles not only on land, but in the open waters that stitched continents together. Naval power wasn't just about domination. It was about vision. It was about understanding that to rule the sea was to command connection, to control trade, to protect borders, to influence thought, belief, and destiny itself. For the empires that dared to master the waves, Athens, Carthage, Rome, Egypt, naval strength was never merely a strategy. It was survival. It was glory. And sometimes it was ruin. In those oar-beaten waters, men rowed not just for victory, but for a place in history. Their ships are gone now, their hulls lost to time, their sails tattered by centuries of silence. But their legacy still ripples across every modern coast. Because long before satellites tracked the seas, before engines roared and missiles flew, the world was already at war for the oceans. And those who learned to ride the tide didn't just win battles. They wrote civilization's first great chapters across the sea.